Good evening. Thanks so much for joining us this evening. We're excited for this extremely important conversation during the month of February, celebrating Black History Month, especially during this year where there's such an incredible calculated seeming attack on the ability to speak openly as much about the need for culturally relevant lessons and what's important for our students in the classroom. I'm joined by an outstanding group of educators here tonight. We'll probably introduce themselves, but I'm Pete Stone. I teach in Chester County School District, around my 10th year doing so, working with the SCEA the past few years. And just this conversation tonight is going to be centered around bringing you some tips and information on how you can meaningfully celebrate Black History Month, have the hard discussions that need to be had, and not just during this month, but keep that celebration, recognition, and conversation going throughout the entire year. And we have some wonderful panelists. Well, I'll introduce themselves. If everyone do me a favor, if you're watching this, if you're on the show as well, panelists, if you would share this with your audience, we can broaden this out. You just take a minute to go to Facebook and just hit share to your Facebook audience as well, so they can be a part of it and ask questions during it. And if you're joining us right now live as well, please post your comments or questions and we'll bring them on to discuss. So everyone just take a minute to share that. And we will go around and introduce ourselves, I guess, starting with Dr. Sheikah Houston.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Dr. Sheikah Houston. I am an educator. This is my 21st year in education. I've been a teacher, an assistant principal, a principal, and currently I'm the director of secondary intervention in Chester County School District. I'm also a trainer for Create and Educate. We help principals in schools that are in state sanctioned school improvement.
Thank you.
Happy to be here.
All right, Sade, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Greetings, everyone. My name is Sade Collins. I am currently the African Studies teacher in Richland School District 2. I teach at Jackson Creek Elementary, and this is my 26th year in education. And so I also serve as a model teacher for the Center for the Education and Equity of African American Students, and an adjunct instructor at the University of South Carolina. So I'm glad to be here, and I agree that this is an important conversation that we need to have.
Dr. Boutte?
Hello, everyone. I am Dr. Gloria Boutte. I am Interim Associate Dean of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at the University of South Carolina. I'm also a Carolina Distinguished Professor there. And I am the founder and executive director of the Center for the Education and Equity of African American Students. And I'm happy to be here as well.
Appreciate it. Again, join us. Please comment below. Love to hear from you as well during the conversation. Please keep sharing it. So, when we look at Black History Month, just to frame this conversation and get it going, the importance of focusing on a highly concentrated effort to recognize Black excellence and also recognize the overcoming of tremendous adversity that is part of our country's heritage, so that our students, one, in our classrooms feel included and recognized, and also aware of some of those obstacles and impediments to learning traditionally and still currently, to become more aware of what those factors are, that they are confronting. And then for everyone to dive into that richness that does not get talked about enough. On the other side of that, what can we do to ensure that this is not something that just becomes a obligatory holiday of parading out things to put up? I was at the conference in Columbia, Dr. Boutte, and the speaker I went to said that while he enjoyed Black History Month, he always felt hurt because it was like March 1st, all these heroes went away and out came the leprechauns. And we talk about St. Patrick's Day. So it felt a little contrived to him. And so I wanted this conversation we can center around how do we make this month meaningful, and not feel like it's the obligatory appreciation month, which is usually for nurses and teachers who we know we don't appreciate enough during the year. So it's like, okay, we don't normally appreciate you, so we're going to pretend like we are for this week, and then we're going to go back to ignoring what we should be doing. Who would like to jump into that conversation?
Well, I can start. I think that first we definitely have to acknowledge that Carter G. Woodson started Black History Month. It started off as a week and then extended to a month to make sure that African Americans were aware of their heritage and their culture, not only African Americans, but everyone else too, because it was so important and so many things were being left out. I think as educators, we have to make sure when we're talking about, we're ensuring that our students are self-aware, and we're making sure that we are appealing to social and emotional learning. Being aware of who is in your classroom ensures that we are cognizant of their culture and making sure that we're embedding that into the curriculum so they see themselves in the curriculum, so that they can make sure that it's relevant for them and it pertains to them.
Yes,
Yeah, I'll co-narrate on that as well. And Pete, it is both celebrate the month so you can amplify the experiences and the culture and the history of Black people, but also do it year round, as we'll talk about in this conversation. But we're definitely not at the point where we get rid of Black History Month
right,
because most places are really rarely addressing Black history in any substantive kind of way year long.
right.
And so I would say both and.
Hmm.
And as teachers engage their students through culturally relevant pedagogy, so really centering what they're doing within their classrooms and not only the students' histories, but looking at how they can foster that academic success and building through all year long, and then also amplifying in February that cultural competence, and then building that important piece of the critical consciousness. And so, as teachers do this, then what it really does is provide the students opportunities to not only learn about themselves, but also to learn about others, because that's very important as well. And so, as we have this conversation, we can consider what are the ways that we can really do that so that students, regardless of our student population, are not just learning about the sheroes and heroes that traditionally may be mentioned in a sidebar in a textbook, but really looking at the collective struggle, the collective resilience, the collective joy, and how we can really center that in our teaching throughout the entire year.
Yeah, I think that's important when we look at timelines. And you mentioned not just looking at sheroes and heroes, but looking at these timelines and how one um, event affects the next event. When we look at history in more of a collective way, that way that somehow gets lost, and we look at how recent it was, where especially in South Carolina, we just desegregated our schools fully, and still there are areas of kind of fighting that still. And with the voucher system going out now, it's almost like an effort to resegregate the schools in some way. But I think getting more to that later, what would be interesting to kind of start this conversation off as well is to think back to when each of us were in school during Black History Month. How was it for us then? What did it mean to us then? And where has it come since then in 2023? Has it progressed? Has it stayed the same? How did it first impact each of you when you were a student in school in that classroom?
Well,
Well, go ahead, Sade.
I was an elementary student, and I primarily teach elementary students during the day, and then early childhood undergraduates when I teach courses for Carolina in the evenings. So I was an elementary student in the late 70s. And so, thinking about the late 70s, I was fortunate enough to live in Orangeburg, South Carolina, where I attended a predominantly Black high school and elementary school. And so I think my experiences were shaped by having teachers that not only just look like me, which is one piece of it, but also knew the value of me being able to see myself, my classmates being able to see ourselves in our curriculum. And so I think that I had that particular advantage in a way that I probably more than some other students may have been seeing some of those folks, because we learned about the Orangeburg massacre. We learned about what happened in Orangeburg through that time, that period of great struggle, and still there are challenges that continue all across our state and our nation. But just some of the progression. So we learned about some of those things then. I don't know if I would have been in another elementary, middle, and high school, like I said, elementary in those late 70s, whether I would have learned those same things. So I think that was one advantage that I had those individuals already in front of me that had a certain, they wanted to make sure that they centered certain parts of our histories within our curriculum throughout my
Did you
school.
know anybody personally that was involved with that incident, the Orangeburg massacre, or did they
Um,
bring anyone to the school to speak to it who first eyewitnessed it?
and it made, when, even before you asked that question, I had a hard time thinking about what happened in my community and church versus what happened in school, because
Okay.
they were working so nicely together.
Mm,
And so in my church community, I did have a member of my church whose uncle was one of the individuals that the gymnasium SHM is named after.
wow.
And so, yeah, so definitely remember presentations and discussions. And so sometimes it's kind of hard when, as I'm thinking back through these memories, it's like, okay, church and school, they were complementing each other very nicely in during my period of the upbringing and understanding. And also, my parents played a very important role in what I knew and understood as I was going into school. And so, I mean, again, not a perfect experience, but definitely I think I probably had more of the presence of some of those individuals and some of that collective struggle focused in my learning more than I may have had at other places.
Gotcha. Thank you.
And I remember being in high school. I graduated high school in 1995, but I grew up in Chester County, and I had a phenomenal history teacher. So I took Black history. My teacher was Mr. Worthy,
Yes.
and I also took Black literature. One of the things that I remember being upset about, and I recognized the fact that those classes were elective. And so when I asked the question, well, why do I have to take this as an elective? Why isn't this information embedded more so into our mainstream curriculum? And no one really had an answer for that. So I just remember that it was really relevant to me what I was learning. It was about my history. I saw myself in the curriculum. It was more engaging, and I just had wished it was something that I had gotten to take advantage of before I had gotten up at the upper level of my high school academic career.
And I'll chime in as well. So I'm the oldest one on the call, of course. And I actually lived through integration. I was in sixth grade when they integrated the schools. Now, before that time, at our Black school, we actually learned about Black history all year long. And it wasn't until much later, I looked back and realized what they were doing. They had the big old fashioned films that, the black and white films, and we gather once a week or so and learn. Um, so the teachers were very conscious of that. However, once they integrated school, I don't have a memory of a conscious celebration or being taught about Black history. In high school, of course, there were Black students who started demanding that we need to have this on the radar, pretty much like you said, Dr. Houston. and we had a club for Black students, and the teacher there, Miss Scott, was trying to get Black history as a course. We didn't have it as an offering at my high school, but so it sort of disappeared. It went underground. But I was really happy to have had that foundation.
Um, I think when you bring those stories to the forefront, especially to students, and you realize that this is not ancient history, a lot of those things you're talking about, but very recent, it gives more belief in seeing how those events still influence the present moment right now. And Dr. Boutte, you made the comment that kind of went underground. And one thing that I feel like, if you look at what's happening in Florida right now, there's such a push to kind of suppress Black history cultural relevancy even more, even attacking the curriculum from the College Board's AP course. Uh, Dr. Houston, one thing I've heard, and that word that you're not allowed to say, white privilege, is when your history is core and the other student's history is an elective. And that's just a fact when we need to, again, bring that into the core curriculum, not just as an elective. But we're at a time right now where that's looking increasingly difficult to talk about at all. But this is why I think Black History Month is so important. It's kind of a staple that, thank God, no one, at least at my school or here, you can talk about important issues during Black History Month, and people say, well, okay, it's Black History Month. So it does open the doors. I encourage anyone watching to use February as a month to use your voice to speak up for these things that need to be told in Black history. So before that does not go underground, but stays as an opportunity. And thank God for those who made this possible, who we um, mentioned earlier. My experiences with with Mr. Wayne Worthy as well with Black History Month in school, and I was fortunate enough in Chester County schools to have my 5-year kindergarten teacher was an African American teacher, Miss Darlene Knox, and then I had Miss Owens in 6th grade. Did you have Miss Owens?
I did.
Okay. She
Hmm.
gave us an amazing Black History Month project that was, I think, I remember right, it was like 100 Black History figures, which went well beyond the traditional ones we heard of. And that started for me to plant seeds, as well as wondering why I didn't hear more about these individuals throughout the year, to push away some of the romanticism of the Confederacy that you've been told this is Northern aggression that paints these stories. It wasn't about slavery, and encouraged me to actually read the letters of secession because of Black History Month and read it with South Carolinians who very explicitly wrote, we're fighting this war over slavery. And I was like, well, I've been kind of lied to my whole life because I heard that it wasn't about slavery, but here South Carolinians are saying no, it's about the state right to own slaves. So that was important for me as a white student to have my eyes open because so many of my peers and classmates were Black students. And so it helped me connect better with my peers and make me more exposed. I've always been grateful for that. Speaking of which, one thing I talked about, what can teachers, educators do right now to push back against this anti CRT thing that's being proposed? And how can we use Black History Month as kind of a catalyst, if you will, to find our voices before they're taken away about these important topics?
I think one thing that they could definitely do is just help prove what research has already proven about making sure that culturally relevant pedagogy is included. Gloria Latson Billings has done significant work in this area, and I've looked up some things that, with her research, she has found that culturally relevant teaching leads to students having more academic success, increased rigor, better attendance, stronger perception of themselves. So just areas where they can use units of study that shows the attendance was greater, students were more engaged in the curriculum, their academic success was higher than it was in some other areas or units where those that information wasn't taught, just helps to prove that point. And if we're focusing on our subgroups, and I hate even using that word because that's a
Mhm.
whole nother can of worms. If we are trying to reach students that we're saying are have an opportunity gap, then if these are things that's going to help them, why not do those things?
Hmm.
Yeah, I think we have to think about just telling truthful and accurate history. And that means you, of course, can't leave any one group out of that story. And this needs to be done in a very deep way. We haven't said this yet, but when we talk about learning about Black history and celebrating Black History Month, it is, you're right, it's helpful for the identity development of Black students, but also is very important for white students and other students of color as well. One part of culturally relevant teaching is teaching students to be critically conscious. And part of that includes their voices, the voices of multiple people, questioning, thinking about history. Like you gave the example a minute ago, Pete, about, you know, being really mistaught about the purpose of the Civil War, right?
Hmm.
When we teach students how to be critically conscious, they start to question, but um, I mean, ethically, it's just wrong to leave out part of people's history, right?
Hmm.
It's very wrong. And this is sort of related to talking about the Civil War, but I'm kind of going in a different direction here because one thing I want to be sure to say as we're thinking about how we teach about Black history in a comprehensive way. My husband and I have a curriculum we call Doctors of the Diaspora, and it's for preschool through 12th grade students. And we try to spend 4 to 8 weeks in a school teaching about, Black history, culture, and so forth. And we have a framework for doing that. An important part of that framework is that you don't start the history with enslavement.
Right.
That you make sure you're including um, beginning with ancient Africa
Hmm.
and showing Black people as cultural people, as historical people, not as acultural. Um, Looking at some of those cultural continuities that we have seen um, across time and space. Sade and I often go to different countries in Africa, and this summer we're actually going to Barbados, but we look at connections between African and African American history and culture. So, another part that should be taught all year long are some of those cultural aspects that we've seen of Black people. For example, perseverance, communalism, orality, movement. We see them in so many different ways wherever we are. So we might go to Cameroon, it looks one way. We come to the US, it looks another way. This is something that can be taught, those cultural assets that are legacies that have morphed over time, but the deep cultural aspects have remained in place. So part of our model includes teaching about African values and how people who are African descendant people, what that looks like in the world, and teaching what we call, what LeGarrette King calls um, Black cultural consciousness. And that includes teaching things about the agency of Black people, regardless of the time period, and show that cultural continuity, the resistance. We tell the stories in a way that complicates us. We're not a monolith. We show variation, but we tell very rounded stories, and we do this all year long. And it's very easy to do this while you're teaching the standards. It doesn't have to be a standalone thing. Sade in her classroom does a beautiful job, and hopefully she'll get a chance to talk about her teaching of African studies. And that is a required course in her school for kindergarten through 5th grade.
Wonderful.
All students take that course as one of their special areas. And so this is what, your second or third year doing that.
This is our second year.
Yeah, but so those kind of things are typically missing. And one of the reasons I think, people hesitate to teach about Black history is because they have not been taught how to do it well.
Mm.
We're lucky at the University of South Carolina. We have an undergraduate and a graduate course on what we call African diaspora literacies, which means to be literate, to be educated about Black people, Black descendant people, and what that means for teaching about them.
And I agree. I also think that one of the other reasons is that a lot of even African Americans, we don't know our history because we've gone through American schools that have not taught us our true history, like you talked about, where it is not just starting at slavery. And one of the things that was helpful when our school was in school improvement status and we were able to improve, we brought in Dr. Chika Akua. He's a professor at Clark Atlanta University, but his presentation to the students, just showing them that ancient culture and all of the things from Africa that were that are we've seen in our history here that were derived from Africa. A lot of times when we had brought in speakers previously, that the students weren't attentive. You know, they were talking, but all of the students had their eyes on him. They were captivated by what he was talking about because they saw themselves in that curriculum, and it was empowering. And the thing that's also troublesome to me about the reasons that have been given where we're not going to do that in states like South Carolina and Florida, the excuse has been given, we don't want children to feel bad about themselves. Well, what about other students who are not empowered? You know, this doesn't have to be a thing where it's making children feel bad about themselves. It's information, it's educational, and we teach them how to navigate those things.
And when I'm discussing difficult issues with students as young as 5 years old, when we talk about just the experiences, the cultural experiences of different groups, and one, we don't just focus on the challenges, but we also look at the resilience and the joy as well. But we talk about what's fair and what's unfair. And so, as Pete was saying, he used his teacher was using a primary source in order for them to examine that primary source and then draw some conclusions from that source. And that is in our South Carolina social studies standards. And so, if we're pulling primary sources and secondary sources, we're able to help the students be able to examine those sources and really look at what does this say about the experiences of certain groups during these times throughout history. And how can we now make connections from the past and then also from current history as well? One of the things that I learned, I've known Dr. Boutte since I was an undergraduate and have taken several of her courses and working with her as I pursue my doctorate. One of the things that I learned very early on is that as we look at the continent of Africa, that we can't just focus on, that we need to focus on ancient Africa, but also bringing that forward to contemporary Africa as well. Because the students need to be able to see that there are children and families on the continent of Africa that are very similar to mine. They eat, they love, they have ways that they're educated, they have ways that their families work within their communities to make their communities better. And there's great diversity on the continent of Africa. And so as we're looking at Black history, we're making all of these connections because you cannot have Black history, as Dr. Boutte was saying, without connecting it to the continent. So it doesn't just have to be connecting it to the continent to the point of colonization and enslavement, but connecting it even contemporarily to the continent as well. And so all of these pieces are very important. And think about it. If we're only focusing on Black history during the month of February, truly there isn't time to do all these things. But if we're looking at how we have these explorations across these themes over the course of a school year, it really allows us as teachers to be able to dive deeply with our students, to pull those primary and secondary sources, to interview our community elders, because there's so many wonderful ways that our students can experience history and the lives of others and enrich and understand their own lives and the richness of their own lives and histories as well. And so there are lots of pieces to this puzzle as we're having this conversation.
That's a great point too. One last made about bringing in community leaders to the schools throughout the year to speak about the richness of Black history and the overcoming of adversity in those stories. One question I think popped up in the comments too was the course that you were talking about that's
Mhm.
required. One, if you could speak a little more, someone asked what the name of that was again. What curriculum are you using for that? And two, how did that course get created? Like, what forces came together to say, yes, we're going to do this? That maybe other districts could say, let's copy that blueprint and do something similar.
Okay. Leadership matters.
Okay.
So I have a principal who informed me that we were going to have an African Studies course. And
Okay.
so this was something that she believed was very important for all of our students. Our pre-pandemic, we were upwards of about 650 students at Jackson Creek, maybe a few more. Now we're around mid 500, so about 550. But for all of our students to understand, one, Africa as the mother continent,
Hmm.
and then work our way toward the present day. And so, so if Africans, as African studies, we will believe stays around, we'll have some students who will have had African studies kindergarten through fifth grade.
Great.
And for me, that's very exciting as an instructor. As far as the curriculum, again, I am so fortunate to have been able to work with Dr. Boutte and Dr. George Johnson and others. And I've been a Fulbright participant. So I have visited Cameroon for a month, Ghana for a month, and also Nigeria this past summer for a month as a Fulbright participant. And so, as a part of those experiences, we dive deeply into understanding the cultures and the histories of the places where we're going. And we go in collaboration with our colleagues that are there within these countries. And so, there was a lot of work done there. Also, just my studies on African diaspora literacy. And I almost served as an intern, even though it wasn't unofficial, with Dr. Boutte one summer. As she was working with Dr. George Johnson with our students at Jackson Creek using the doctor's diaspora curriculum. So from that, fast forward a couple of years, I basically write the curriculum for the African Studies program, kindergarten through fifth. And so I consult with Dr. Boutte. I also do a lot of homework and a lot of research. And I try to use as many, as we were talking about before, primary and secondary sources, use a lot of video clips because I want the students to be able to hear from people and their about their own cultural experiences in their own words. So it's not them listening to me tell them about other groups of people, but them actually being able to sing the songs with someone from that place singing the song and telling the meanings of the song. We also talk about the African diaspora. So our students are able to see, oh, wait a minute, I have family from Honduras, Guatemala, from the UK. That's a part of the African diaspora. So we're all connected here. And that's part of what we do in African studies is show how we're connected. And just so that everyone is clear, I have each group of students. They come with their class once a week for 50 minutes. So I'm a part of the related art schedule. So their class has me once a week, art, PE, media center, and also music. So yes, so I get to see all of the students weekly for 50 minutes of African studies. So
Wonderful.
yeah, so it really has been an experience that is as served to help me grow as a professional. And then also just the teachers have told me, it's like, it's amazing what my students can identify and talk about on maps, or how they're making connections across cultures, or how they'll say, oh, wait a minute, we talked about that in African studies. I have the reading interventionist that will tell me they're reading a book with the students and they were like, oh yeah, we learned about that in African studies. So it really goes across the curriculum. So this is not just, some would think it was geography studies, others may think it's just purely history. But as I tell the students, anything before this moment is history.
Mhm.
And you are an important part of history. And so even though your life may not be in a book at this moment or may never be in a book, you're still an important part of history. So we talk about the recent past, we talk about the distant past. So yes, African Studies gives me an opportunity. And let me just give a real quick word just about my background. Prior to teaching African Studies, I taught pre-kindergarten, kindergarten, first, second, third and fourth grade gifted and talented, and kindergarten through fifth grade science lab. And I've also worked with the South Carolina Department of Education on writing curriculum based on new standards in social studies. And so being able to put all these pieces together has helped support me being able to write the curriculum and also collaborate with my colleagues throughout the building. So I'm also supporting what's going on within the classrooms.
Gotcha. Thank you.
And what's the demographics of your school?
Jackson Creek is, let's see, I think now probably about 90% 90% of our families would identify as Black or African American. And then we have probably another maybe 7 or 8% that would identify as Hispanic or Latino or Latina. And then we have a smaller percentage of students who would identify as Pacific Islander, white, or may have some other either racialized or ethnic identification.
And was there any type of pushback from anyone?
Not pushback. We haven't received any pushback. I have received questions. Now, there's, especially when we first got started, some of the parents just wanted to know, so exactly what's going to be taught in African studies? Because if you think about, we talk about Black history not being taught, think about what's typically taught about Africa. And so think about how we usually see children with distended stomachs and send some money to support them. You know, that's the type of narrative about the continent. Because for the first, oh goodness, probably 2 months, I would still get the questions from the students. So you mean they have cell phones? You mean they wear shoes? You know, and if they were ever to go to Lagos or one of these other very large cities, they would say they have a lot of traffic, they have, you know, SUVs, they have multiple cell phones, you know, all of these things. And so once the parents started to hear the songs played 500 times at home, or they say, my child came home and searched this dance or this clip that you showed them, then really it built excitement. And so, no, it's been a very positive experience. We presented to the school board last school year. I think it was last school year or earlier this school year, and received very positive feedback. And we've had board members come in to visit. We've had superintendent in to visit. So it's been a very positive experience.
And I will say one other thing too about that. Um, when we do the Doctors of the Diaspora curriculum, we've done it actually mostly at majority white schools, and it's just been beautifully transformational. I have comments from white students saying things like, "I never knew there were 55 countries in Africa, that there were so many languages, or that the richest person ever to live to date, was from Mali, and that some of the things that people were enslaved did." Because we used an approach where we start with ancient Africa, and as Ms. Collins said, we take that back around to contemporary time, but it's recursive. So we do enslavement, we do Reconstruction, Jim Crow, civil rights, and then contemporary, and just continue that. It's not necessarily linear, but the white students, have felt illuminated, and it really is a shame when we keep history from students. Um, and then when we think about the role that these inaccuracies and these distortions about Black people and what that does to white children, it affects their socialization too. And it's not surprising that white children grow up thinking that, well, white people are the people who've done all the great things in the world, because that's what they've been taught. That's a natural conclusion when other histories have been excluded. And so, in fact, for Miss Collins' class, Dr. Jarvis Jackson, when he was working on his dissertation, he studied her class, and it was surprising. The parents at that school asked a few questions, but overall, at that school, it's been very favorable. Um, It's also been very favorable at the white schools that we've done it at, from the families and from the children.
That's a great point. And someone, anyone watching this right now, too, I want to speak to a statistic the SCA showed is that the overwhelming majority of parents are highly supportive of their child's teacher. And a lot of these kind of stories that get pushed on popular media shows are scare tactics for partisan political gain. So I think it's real important for educators not to lose courage in your voice to speak the truth about these things and to dive deep into the richness of this history because, as you say, white students, Hispanic students are interested in learning. When in South Carolina, we have such a wonderful large population of black students in our classroom that there's a huge void that is left out when we don't include them in that uh, curriculum. But just anyone watching, please be continue to use your voice and don't believe the headlines that scare you from speaking because I think that's what so much of it is that fear to quiet you from sharing the truth in these rich stories. As a white student myself, I mentioned Mr. Worthy and also Miss Lewis from Chester who really poured great wisdom into us going over the complete history. She taught me American history and world history. And it was so enriching to me that when I got to Clemson, I wanted to take an African studies course. And I'm glad I did because I bring a lot of what I continue to learn back with me to my students now in the classroom. And you mentioned that one issue that educators have is they don't have this knowledge to teach their students. And so you got to make an effort to find it, but it's out there. And hopefully, if you're watching this right now, you'll be aware hey, look for this. If students seem disengaged, it's not because kids these days, I think it's curriculum these days feels empty. And if you want to enrich it, use Black history, African history, and then during Hispanic Heritage Month as well. These are wonderful times. And then throughout the whole year, and you will notice a difference with your students. Dr. Houston talked about the the engagement of students during that presentation is
Mhm.
palpable because it is
Mhm.
real. We talk about Sunday Antiquita in my class and Mansa Musa, the richest man in history, and we go to the ancient history. And then we get up, and some people will say, well, why are there some impoverished countries in Africa? And I do point out because they are shot as well when you learn their cities and richness, modern day Africa. And I say, well, and some of the reasons Africa struggles today is because of the colonialism that came in from
Mhm.
Europe. The Belgium Congo is a genocide that never gets talked about, even though 10 to 12 million Africans died, which is the same number in the Holocaust. And we need to talk about the Holocaust and the Belgian Congo and bring that in as well. One question I want to ask y'all too, though, is to help educators out there. One thing I'm asked: some, how do you speak about bring in a balance of the excellence and richness, and also dive into the adversities and strife without re-traumatizing your black students? And that's what I want to focus on because I think the bring
Mhm.
it before we end that discussion of it's not about white guilt or making white people feel guilty. That's not the point. I think that's the narrative that's being created from outside that you can't talk about black history or it's against white people. It's just not. We're it's not either or. It's like you said, it's and. But could you speak about being sensitive to bring up topics that might trigger re-traumatization, but still need to be talked about in our classrooms?
I'll start this and then I'll chime in later as well. But one of the reasons white students, black students, and other students are traumatized is one, people don't have a framework for doing this. And by the way, learning for justice that used to be
Teaching tolerance.
yeah, teaching tolerance has some
Mhm.
good resources. I put my book in the link and I'm gonna put some more books in the link for people. And so the other reason they're traumatized is because just think about what they learn. I mean, they start the history with enslavement.
Hmm.
It's told in a very deficit based, from a very deficit based perspective. Then you might jump to civil rights. Again, that's a whole trauma. You don't hear the things like Miss Collins said, the Black joy. You
Hmm.
don't hear about the triumphs. You don't hear about resistance. You don't hear about the cultural continuities that we have seen and we'll see always. So those things are always missing. And so that traumatizes students. Another strategy um, we use the strategy of teaching about multiple perspectives and understanding that at any point in history, with any event that happens, that there are multiple perspectives existing. And so we students often engage in something called either a dialogue poem, a dialogue story, or dialogue pictures for younger kids. Or let's say you're telling the story of African people who were taken from the continent of Africa, and students can think about, what were the African people experiencing, what was the experiences of the white people who were doing this, so they can kind of see these stories side by side. um, and these are things that just happen. It's authentic, it's truthful, but you show multiple perspectives and be very, very intentional about, again, showing that no particular race um, has all virtue or all vice. Okay, uh, so nobody has a monopoly on that. But so you're very intentional in how you're teaching it. It cannot be haphazard, and I think that's why we've seen the teaching, particularly of enslavement, gone badly wrong. Again, the Learning for Justice has a really, really nice framework for people when you're going to do that, how you teach about it. They don't recommend role playing because that goes badly, right? And so there's certain things you can do very badly. But I think teachers who are committed to doing this work know there are resources out there, like the Zinn project. Lots of good lessons for how do you teach about, Black history and other histories as well. So, consult that. And to your earlier point, Pete, about how do you continue to do this? I also recommend collaboration is so important, and networking, because teachers are actually being harassed. So definitely collaborate with others, people who are informed. The Center for the Education and Equity of African American Students, we have regular events. Um, Talk with your administrators, talk with families, as Ms. Collins does, so they know what's coming. They feel like they have a voice, at least, understand what's going on, because a lot of times, because of the sound bites that are around, parents have a lot of misunderstandings. And when you sit down and talk and say, here's what we're teaching, parents are, oh, okay.
Right.
So, those conversations, I think, keep from traumatizing the students.
And,
Nobody's history should be only drudgery.
and
Right.
one of
Should
the things that I think is, oh, I'm sorry, Dr.
No,
Petit.
I was talking too much. It's fine.
And one of the things that I think is really important for us to do is also to get to know each other within our school buildings. It's amazing how, if we just get to know each other well, how we have history already in our buildings, and how we can share the stories share our own stories. Our colleagues can share their stories, and it really helps us to develop a different layer of respect for each other. And then we can ask each other, so this is what I'm thinking about doing. Tell me what your thoughts are. And you're having these cross racial conversations,
Mm.
which are very important. I had a colleague ask me about a situation. This colleague would identify as white. And she knew that if she had spoken to a parent about a concern in a certain way, that it may be perceived as though she was not being culturally sensitive to the student. But we were able to have that conversation. And so I think that's another piece of this, is that we also have to get to know each other and understand as humans that we're all having these human experiences. We all have histories. And if we're able to get to know each other, then we're supporting each other through some of these tough issues that we're discussing. I have a colleague who identifies as white, and a white man, and he and I co-teach as often as we can. And because we know there's certain things that we can each explain that help the students make these connections. And also they get the pure visual of the two of us there together in solidarity, discussing joyful issues, but tough issues as well. So I think that collaboration piece with other colleagues, whether they're colleagues in their building, built in your building, or networks beyond your building, that piece is very important because doing this work alone will be very tough at times. And so when you have colleagues that can be there and you can support each other, whether it's an organization like the SCEA, or whether it's a book study group within, your community, or just you and a colleague that are like-minded and like-hearted at school. Just make sure that you have someone that you can reach out to, and you can reach out to me as well, because we're all in this together, and this is very important work. And it's easy to get discouraged because there's so much coming at you that will discourage you. But if we are working through this together, it really does help us to be able to make it through those difficult moments, because we know our goal is for our students to just be well informed and also to be caring human beings,
Hmm.
that can go out into the world and understand that the world is a very diverse place, but there
Right.
are reasons why things are the way they are, and that we can make the world a better.
Yes.
And just to chime into both of you all's points, Dr. Boutte talked about making sure you have a framework, and that is very important. My daughter came home traumatized a little after a lesson where she was shown a video of Ruby Bridges, returning to school with all of the people yelling at her, but she was in kindergarten. So that was not appropriate for her to see at that young age. So she was, really upset. She didn't know how to process that. And we had to really work through that when she got home. But you're so right. A framework is so important. Age appropriateness of what is being taught and what is being used is important. And also making sure parents are a part of that process, because that wasn't something that I wanted her to see at such a very young age. And one of the frameworks that my partner, Dr. Tammy Taylor, and I use is Dr. Hudson Weems' framework, which is Africana Womanism. And she also has the um, conjoining part of that, the Africana Man, but it's a framework as well. But I definitely want to hear more about Dr. Boutte's framework as well. And someone asked in the comments, do you offer any type of recertification credits with your framework, or opportunities for teachers to learn through recertification with your framework, Dr. Boutte, and your curriculum?
Yes, we actually do. The center offers um, professional development credits. We do professional development with schools. We prefer not to do a one-time presentation because obviously there's a lot of work that needs to be done to bring people to an understanding of what we're doing. But we do
Mm-hmm.
that very often. I'll put a link in the chat for that as well. But something you said, Dr. Houston, also made me think about, you were talking about your daughter.
Mm-hmm.
You know, children are traumatized in many different ways. And let me just say, Black children are traumatized by this Eurocentric curriculum in ways
Mm-hmm.
that we don't speak of. But I remember when my son was, I guess, in third or fourth grade, and he came home terrified because they had taught about the KKK. Nobody ever hesitated to teach that. And he was afraid that these white people with these sheets were going to come after us. Because again, nobody taught him about, Deacons of Defense or Black Panthers or, Black people who stood up, and nobody taught him about the whole idea that, this is a form of bullying. When you see people who have more power than you attacking you, he felt very vulnerable. And and this is coming from a home where we teach about Black history and where he has some buffers, but it was terrifying. And there are many other things we teach in the curriculum when we don't teach in a comprehensive way and don't teach about the histories of all people. And we continue to leave out Mexican American history, Chinese American history, all the other heritage. We leave those things out, and not only are our children being traumatized, but again, it's also having a negative effect on white children as well. And we just need to get this right and make sure we're teaching children in a way that's truthful.
Yes.
I agree. And the last point I wanted to make, Ms. Sade, when she mentioned the collaboration, we have a large population of international teachers at our school. And one of the things that we were intentional about was allowing them to share their culture with us. They put together presentations about their political system, and it was a whole staff development. We had a meal centered around their culture. It was our teachers from Jamaica as well as from the Philippines. So it really taught us a lot about their culture, and it was a really positive experience. So that collaboration piece that you talked about, I think really is something that does work, and we've seen it work in that capacity as well.
Yeah, about out of time here. I think it's important to realize there are bills being proposed right now in our state to kind of muffle even more the ability to speak about sharing the truth, which someone just posted. That truth is the bomb, is the healing for trauma, facing trauma. And one other thing that's key too is oftentimes our educators are so bombarded. Someone mentioned read to succeed with seemingly meaningless things that just occupy time that could be spent learning a much more meaningful curriculum for our students, things of how to teach the structure of Black history throughout the year. That would be something way more valuable than Read to Succeed for educators to get. So we could identify better with the students in our classroom. And the more time we spend on things that don't really matter that much, less time we have to spend on things that do.
And I want to say that it's a false dichotomy that you're either teaching Black history or you're teaching skills.
Yeah.
All of the content areas are taught very thoroughly
Hmm.
through Black history and through any other histories as well.
Right.
But of course, that soundbite that they have out there makes us think that we need to get back to reading, writing, and arithmetic. Well, that's what we
Arithmetic.
do. And by the way, if we look at the track record, how well we've done that for Black children, we've not done a good job of that, period. And so we need to again, not to believe all the hype and all the information that people are hearing out there. um, there's no dichotomy between teaching cultural histories and teaching content.
Right. And I think it's so important, especially the English standards. Nowhere in the English standards does it say ninth grade English is whatever, and 10th, 11th grade is American literature, and 12th grade literature is British literature. That's not anywhere in the standards. Any grade in English in high school can teach any piece of literature whatsoever, or nonfiction. So I think that's a way where educators watching right now could bring in that meaningful curriculum, teach those standards and those skills as you're saying, and make it so much more meaningful for your students, and you're teaching the standards.
I mean, Miss Collins teaches math, science, social studies, the arts. I mean, literacy. She does it all
Yes.
through African studies. Excuse me.
Yes. Well, anybody have any final comments you want to add with our last couple minutes here?
Just thank you for the space to have the conversation. It was really nice meeting you ladies. I hope to connect with Dr. Boutte and learn more about her curriculum, and even visit Ms. Collins' class, because I love the fact that that is something all of the students at the school are being able to participate in.
Absolutely. And I am going to get ready to put my email in the chat. And so if you would like to,
If you put that, or you're putting it in the chat for us internally, because otherwise, if you do it, it's going on Facebook. Just so you know.
oh, okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah, and send that group email I sent out to everybody too. That
Okay,
way
good.
someone is finding it.
So yes, use that group email.
Yeah.
Yes, yes.
But
Because we look forward to working with you, Dr. Houston.
absolutely,
Absolutely.
absolutely.
And as
And
always, thank you, Pete, for
Thank
doing
you.
this.
Thank
absolutely.
you.
And
Thank you.
yes,
Wonderful
and
conversation.
teachers be encouraged. Just
Yes.
continue to do the work that is going to be culturally edifying and sustaining to your students, because we all will reap the benefits because we'll have just caring, loving, knowledgeable human beings.
And I echo that, teachers, you are amazing. And don't let anybody tell you otherwise.
That's right. Amen. Well, thanks everyone so much for watching. Please follow up, continue to share this even after the live session. Post your comments. We'll get back in contact with you within those resources mentioned tonight, or our wonderful panelists and the resources they have to offer. But educate yourself, research, and share that wisdom and richness with your students. Be the change you wish to see onwards, outwards, and upwards. Blessings, and thank everyone so much.